So right after we finished building it, boom, finally these mining companies reached out to them and they're like, awesome, you built it. Okay, come to my site. Let's use this thing and let's see if we can find copper. So we've got 4 customers in the pipeline right now.
Welcome to AI Founders Mindset. Today's episode, interviewing Jeremiah, the founder CEO, Aura. In this episode, you can learn why deep tech is more attractive to investors more than crowded AI startups, and how Jeremiah's startup, Aura, built hardware, closed their first customer, and started generating revenue within a month. Actually, interviewing the deep tech startup founder is my first time, so I'm so excited. Let's dive in. Hi, Jeremy. Thank you so much for being here. Tell us about yourself.
Okay, so I am the CEO and co-founder of Outer Rim Exploration, or
Aura.
So we're a deep tech startup, and we are solving a critical need, which is speeding up the discovery and reducing the cost for critical minerals worldwide. This is a critical need right now, both in Japan and the US and all over the place. So we've developed a novel sensor for doing this.
I would love to know more deeply. So let's deep dive into about Aura.
So there are supernova explosions, right? Stars have been exploding since pretty much the birth of the universe. And when stars explode, they shoot out these they shoot out these high energy particles called cosmic galactic rays. These are constantly showering the Earth actually from space. So when a cosmic galactic ray hits the Earth's atmosphere, there's actually a reaction and it creates a shower of particles. One of those particles is very special. It's called the muon. Muon. Muon, yes. So the muon is special because it can pass through all of the atmosphere and it can pass through about 1 kilometer thick of Earth. Our sensors are a special array of particle detectors which can watch these muons, and they can watch the muons. It's like a telescope watching muons, and they can measure the absorption of their energy in the same way that a CT scan works. So basically, we're able to do a CT scan of the subsurface and create maps to identify mineral ore deposits.
Like 3D mapping?
Exactly. We create, the product is a 3D density map. So you get like these voxels, this 3D image. And in the hands of a geologist and a mining company, this is the most valuable data set that they could possibly have to reduce cost and increase the speed for finding an economically feasible mineral deposit and making the decision to spend $1 billion to create a mine.
I see.
Rare earth minerals are in extremely high demand. This is partly due to the geopolitics, with some countries hoarding their supplies. This is part of what's driving the demand, but you can see the price of copper and of gold, but also of many rare earths is just skyrocketing. And this is partly to do that. Also with electrification. So, the demand for AI and Gen AI is just enormous right now, right? Well, in order to do AI, you need computers, you need a lot of compute. For that, you need copper, you need electrification. But if you look at the forecasts in the next 5 and 10 years, we can't keep up with the demand. There's not enough copper right now being extracted to keep up with the demand. So the timing for what we're building, I would say, is perfect on the macroscopic level.
I see. Interesting. So could you please tell us some specific example or use case?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually, have exciting news. We're a startup. We just finished building our product 1 month ago. It's this novel particle telescope, and we just deployed at a customer's site last week.
Really?
Yes, in Idaho. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's very exciting. So we're generating revenue. We're getting quick traction despite just making the product less than a month ago, and we are exploring for copper. So Idaho is very mountainous, and there's 2 things happening here actually. One of this customer is an example of a big trend globally of old mines, which are 100 years old, being reopened to just carve them up again, right? So they're reopening these mines. They're wondering, I wonder how many minerals were missed with these old techniques. Also, the price is so high that they can justify creating new mines. So we go in and we map the old mine workings. There's a complex lattice structure of mines. They need to know where the old mine structure is in order to optimize their new mine operations, right? It can be very unsafe if the ground collapses while they're mining. At the same time, we can map the old mine workings. We can also map the mineral deposits like copper. So at the customer site, we've deployed our Muon telescope. It's there for a few weeks, and after a few weeks, we can generate 3D density maps and help the customer to reduce enormous cost on drill exploration in particular. So the crazy thing is, how much do you think it costs to drill into the ground and pull up a sample? For 1 square kilometer, typically at the final phase of exploration, it costs $200,000 per hole, right? It's an average cost. They drill up to 500 meters or deeper. They pull up a sample. They send the sample back to a laboratory to be assayed, to see what's in there, if there's enough mineral deposit. So they're doing this 100 to 200 times over a 1 square kilometer. Each time it costs $100,000 to $200,000, right? So you're talking about, just for 1 square kilometer, you're talking about $20 to $40 million. So our key value proposition actually is that we can reduce the number of times that a mining company needs to drill, and we can reduce also the uncertainty of defining that ore body. So a company can estimate the return on investment of creating a mine. So the work we're doing happens right at the edge of the decision to make a mine. It's the highest risk, most expensive, slowest step in the mineral exploration and mining pipeline. So the immediate need, which we've validated and gaining very rapid traction for, is this mining industry use case. For example, 3D model of Tokyo or San Francisco, and it's something that is, you understand a lot of data, different data points that it's updated in near real time about the surface. But the interesting thing is these digital twins are always about the surface of the Earth, because actually it's incredibly hard to know what's underground. So as you mentioned, there are infrastructure use cases, defense and space use cases. If you can map the underground, it's enormous. You could do things in the future for infrastructure, such as you could monitor underground stability of tunnels. You could look at dams, electric dams, look at subsurface stability. Is there any water underground which is causing the ground to collapse, which would cause damage to bridges, dams, tunnels? So there's many interesting use cases. And the cool thing is we can use the exact same product for those use cases. And we're targeting the industry which recognizes the demand for this the most, which is the mining industries. It started with my master's research, and I was just amazed by the gap of data for the undergrounds. The traditional methods, seismic techniques, gravity techniques, they struggle for many geologies. There's a big uncertainty with the result, and the size of the pixels basically of the image you get are very large. So it's not a lot of rich information that you can make billion-dollar decisions off of. After that, I did what I've done for my whole career, which is take a look at the demand on the problems on the business side, first macroscopically. So during my master's research, I realized that there's a huge technology gap.
What is the differentiation compared to others?
So how we compare to the competition is, we're 10 times lower cost, we're higher resolution, and we have a modular solution that's highly scalable, can cover large areas easily. In a nutshell, that's what I would say. That the mining industry, oil and gas. So the problem is with a gravity survey, it fails in many situations. For example, if you have, this is getting a little nerdy, but if you have a large horizontal oriented feature, or if you've got a thick layer of sediment, let's say you have a 100-meter layer of sand or dirt, gravity surveys are not very effective. It tends to wash things out. Also, they tend to be 2D instead of 3D. In the case of seismic surveys, they are extremely expensive. We're talking about 10 times more expensive than what we're doing for a similar area surveyed. Also, with seismic surveys, they can compete down to about 100 meters. But if you go deeper than 100 meters, the resolution gets awful. So you, again, have this problem, just very vague understanding of the underground. It's not really very effective for optimizing drilling beyond 100 meters or so depth.
Amazing. Okay, so let's talk about how did you get your first paying customer?
Yeah, so to be honest, it's tough. But building a deep tech startup is really tough, especially when you're building hardware. Like we have hardware and we have software. We've got this data science and AI pipeline. We talked to a lot of customers. We were actually originally a cohort company of the UC Berkeley SkyDeck accelerator program. Very prestigious, a very great program, highly recommended to other startups. Reach out to me if you'd like an introduction to John and Caroline. So we got funding from them pre-seed, $200,000 1 year ago. John, who's the general partner, he always pushed everyone. It's like, don't build anything until you talk to the customers, right? Understands the business demands, the problem, the pain points, do customer validation, market validation. So we worked really hard on that before we built anything for the first 6 months. So by doing this, we were able to, break into the mining industry. We attended a lot of conferences. We got this fantastic mining advisor who's an executive of the mining industry, Aaron, and we're able to build the relationships. And we talked to so many mining juniors. We talked to mining majors, BHP and Rio Tinto as well, and quickly realized that there's a big demand for this. But at the end of the day, they said, this is awesome. Density maps solve half of my problem. Amazing. Did you build it yet? And we had to answer, no, I'm sorry, we haven't built it yet. Because SkyDeck has us first asking the question before we build it, how badly do you want it? So the nice thing is we had already done a lot of work on qualifying leads and customer validation and building those relationships. And then we spent 6 months building our first product, which we just finished a month ago. So right after we finished building it, boom, finally these mining companies reached out to them and they're like, awesome, you built it. Okay. Come to my site. Let's use this thing and let's see if we can find copper. So we've got 4 customers in the pipeline right now. These customers alone are getting us on the path to more than $1 million in annual recurring revenue. Just these 4 mining companies alone. And so I think that's sort of the story of how we got here.
I see. Thank you so much. It's amazing. So I want to hear about your fundraising story.
We established the company 2 years ago, and we bootstrapped and worked our butts off. So 1 year ago, we got into Berkeley SkyDeck cohort program.
Yeah.
So they gave us $200,000 in funding. Fantastic program, highly recommended again. And we spent 6 months with the Berkeley SkyDeck program there in Berkeley, California. Yeah. So then we did a demo day with them. They have this big demo day event. They rent this beautiful auditorium at the UC Berkeley campus. So we pitched in front of thousands of investors, both face-to-face and connecting with live tickets online. That was an incredible event, and SkyDeck introduced a lot of VCs, angels and family offices, different types of investors. And so right now we're raising our seed rounds. From a couple of weeks ago, we had the demo day pitch. We've got a lot of momentum. We have right now, to this date, we have $500,000 in soft committed from investors. That will change rapidly. 1 week from now, it'll be much larger. But we are still talking to investors to raise for our seed round. We're doing that with a safe investment of $3 million. And well on our way to getting there.
Thank you so much. You already have a product just built 1 month ago, and you have 1 paying client. Yeah. This is a great materials to convince VCs.
Yes, I think so. We've got defensible novelty. Before we started the raise, we identified some requirements, which I think might be interesting, for other deep tech startups. But We talked a lot to investors beforehand. We understood, a year ago, to understand what they need. We needed LOIs. We needed customer references. We needed a fully built hardware product and data science pipeline and AI pipeline, finished product. We needed to validate it in the field and in the lab, and defensible novelty. And boom, we got all of these requirements finished. So we're in a really good position to raise right now.
I see. So look back in these 2 years. Of course, there are many challenges, but like, what was the biggest challenge?
Okay, yeah, I think assembling a team that's capable of building this product. This is very much deep tech, pun intended, deep tech. So
Yeah.
it's incredibly hard, and it's also it took time to do that. So just to build the team with the competencies to do this was incredibly challenging. But we finally did that, got all the pieces we needed 6 months ago, rapidly built it in less than 6 months. So to give you an example, so the biggest challenge, you need electrical engineering, you need mechanical engineering, you need embedded engineering, you need astrophysics, right? Particle physics and astrophysics expertise, AI and data science expertise, and mining expertise. So you really need all these components, all these competencies to build a company like this. And that was real hard, but we did that, got a really tight, very skilled team, and we demonstrated our ability. So I think that was the biggest challenge, and it's also our moat right now.
I see. I can imagine your company needed to make a product, not only software, hardware as well. So that even making small MVP of sample was kind of a different story than normal SaaS company, right?
Yes, very, very different from a typical Silicon Valley company. And I think honestly, this is attractive for some investors right now. Right now, Gen AI is really big, but I think it's also, we've met a lot of deep tech investors who realize that Gen AI is extremely competitive. Most of those companies will fail, and it is a bubble right now, which will pop eventually. And we've gotten some feedback from investors that they would like to diversify in other areas, and they recognize critical minerals are in extremely high demand right now. And so I think that's really helped us.
Like right place and right time.
Yep, right place and right time. Absolutely.
Tell us your milestone or some ideal situation in 1 year.
So yeah, in 1 year, we will generate more than 1 million in annual recurring revenue. We will deploy our 2nd generation novel hodoscope. I can tell you more details about that. Please reach out to me at jeremy@ora.space later if you're interested.
Yeah.
And very exciting. And also deploy at 5 customer sites, and that'll get us to the 1 million ARR. Yeah, so those are our 1 year milestones.
I see. And in order to achieve this milestone, what kind of pain point do you have currently?
Okay, yeah, so the key thing right now is, as the CEO and also an inventor of the product and product manager, of course, I wear many hats. I would like to focus on the product and the customer 100%. So I want to finish this investment round as quickly as possible so I can focus on the customer and the product again until the Series A funding round. So I think that's obviously the key thing for us now. So if there's any investors who are interested in hearing more, please reach out to me.
Yes, please reach out his LinkedIn.
Yep, LinkedIn or
Gmail,
or
email address.
Yep, jeremy@or.space. Actually, so our team will be at the IMARC conference. IMARC is one of the biggest mining conferences in the world in Sydney, Australia, at the end of this month. And and we'll also be part of the 500 global accelerator programs pitch event, which is at the end of this month as well, to further increase investor interest in San Francisco. Yep, 500 global. It's a very big accelerator. And yeah, so I think those are the two big announcements. And besides that, just customers and customers and traction. So.
Yeah, customer and also investor, you can meet Jerome. Okay, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Kaori. Appreciate it. You're awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye bye. The three key takeaways from the conversation with Jeremiah. 1. Deep tech is rising because AI SaaS feels overcrowded. Jeremiah shares that many investors are now stepping away from the crowded AI SaaS world. Gen AI startups are everywhere, often with similar ideas, and some investors feel the bubble might burst soon. Deep tech startups like Or offer something different: hard technology, real-world application, and defense IP. Investors who want long-term impact, especially in critical industry, are now actively seeking deep tech deals. 2. CT scans for the Earth. The Muon telescope maps the underground using a rare particle from space called a muon. Aura's sensor acts like a telescope for underground geology. It creates 3D maps to help mining companies to find coppers and rare earth minerals. Compared to other exploration methods, Aura's product 10 times cheaper, more accurate, and works deeper, reducing drilling costs by millions of dollars per project. 3. Hardware plus software plus science equal 1 million plus ARR inside. After a month of research and team building, Aura just deploying its first project. And they already have a paying customer and 4 more in the pipeline. They are on track to reach 1 million plus ARR within a year and just launched seed fundraising round after meeting all investor requirements: hardware, AI pipeline, customer reference, real-world validation. Unlike typical SaaS startups, Aura's team includes physicals, mining experts, and engineers, a rare and powerful combination. Okay, thank you so much for watching our episode today. I hope this conversation will help your future and career. If you like it, please subscribe us and give your like. Okay, thank you so much. Bye bye. またね。チャオ。